I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, and I'm glad you ended on that. It's a good segue to our first guest, good friend of the show, Kevin Gosztola, who's the managing editor of shadowproof.com, the curator of the dissenter.org, which, by the way, 3 people have told me in the past week they have started following the dissenter.org because of Kevin's last appearance, and he's also the co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, co-hosted by Rania Khalek. Kevin, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey, it's good to see both of you.
Great shirt, by the way. Kind of twinning a little bit.
Hey, we've got some balance in the frame.
Thank you. Well, sorry, Rania, I think I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was giggling about the fact that you commented on Kevin's shirt.
Oh.
Guys,
I'm sorry. I know there's terrible things happening in the world. Like the only way to get through it is to be able to laugh about these little things sometimes. So thank you for that.
Well, Kevin, I'm curious your thoughts about where Rania just ended, which is the role of the media during this conflict, the omissions, the things that have been said. I don't want to editorialize too much. I know you've been following very closely how it's been covered. How are you evaluating how the mainstream media is informing us about this?
Well, what I've zeroed in on is the complete and total disinterest and lack of coverage of the ceasefire negotiations and the effort to obtain some kind of an agreement. And I also think they've been very confusing about the way they present a ceasefire. I'm a layman, so maybe you're going to take issue with what I have to say, but I understand a ceasefire to come before a peace agreement. I understand a ceasefire to be you agree that you're going to stop bombing and attacking each other, whether it's your military forces that as an occupier or the forces that are being occupied have to come to an agreement first to stop shooting at each other. And then when you have that, then you can have the peace agreement. And there's been this way that the ceasefire negotiations are presented to say, oh, Russia still has military operations. Russia's still conducting strikes, which I think is just, it doesn't really match with what the definition of a ceasefire is. And so obviously you got to get to the table, and they don't really present to you what Russia's demands are. And they don't really talk about Ukraine. And the other thing is there's no real attention to the fact that, in my view, it doesn't seem like the United States has empowered Ukraine to offer anything to Russia in order to get them or an incentive to turn back, which I think is highly dangerous when we're thinking about all of the risks and the threats that you've run down. But I just will very quickly mention them again because I think that they have to be top of mind. The nuclear crisis, we are in a nuclear crisis. In fact, Vladimir Putin has already used his nuclear weapons because he threatened to use nuclear weapons. And when you do that, you are using your nuclear weapons. Daniel Ellsberg wrote a fantastic book documenting this history called The Doomsday Machine. And the US, this is how they use nuclear weapons. They'll threaten to use nuclear weapons. And when you do that, that has an effect. There are 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine where there's fighting happening around these. And that is hugely troubling. We're seeing oil pipelines explode, gas pipelines explode. What kind of ecological devastation is occurring right now? Over 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine. All of this can only be stopped with a ceasefire, and yet the focus of coverage, when they even do mention ceasefire, is never even about the ceasefire. They talk about no-fly zones while they're covering the ceasefire, or they talk about whether Russia will even respect setting up humanitarian corridors if they, because that's something, some news we could actually report. They agreed between Ukraine and Russia during these negotiations to set up humanitarian corridors so that people can flee. And hopefully that makes it easier for people to get out of Ukraine who want to leave the conflict. But immediately, without any evidence whatsoever, they say, well, should we really expect Russia to respect these humanitarian corridors? And they don't come from an opposite angle, because here's the other way you could look at this issue. How fearful should we be that NATO might use those humanitarian corridors to get arms shipments into Ukrainians, which I think would be terrifying for the civilian population and would definitely mean that there would be no escape routes for people who want to get out. And some of these people who are students from other countries that have been trapped, I know there have been Indian students, Chinese students, others who study in Ukraine who have been killed in this conflict and are still trying to get out of the country. So those are just some issues to start with.
I'm curious, Kevin, also, there's another aspect of this war that's playing out now that's quite alarming, and it's the online aspect of it, which is the level of control that American tech giants are exerting at the behest of the American and European governments to shut down any media affiliated with Russia. And it's actually interesting. I'm not in Europe right now. I know RT has been banned at this point, both online, on YouTube, on broadcast, all across Europe. But I'm in Lebanon. And even in Lebanon, I didn't know this. Lebanon is apparently part of Europe because in Lebanon, on Twitter, I can't access any of the different RT like channels. And I find that alarming because it's denying people access to the Russian side. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to believe it, but it's important to be able to hear from all sides in a situation like this. And the US and Europe have just cut off the other side so that everyone is only in their countries, at least in Europe, are only dependent on them. But then what does this say also about the fact that this infrastructure to just take down international channels, it already in place and able to be executed? What are the dangers here for free speech when we see this happening to huge media outlets, even if they're Russian?
Well, the obvious argument is the slippery slope, right? That it doesn't stop with RT and Sputnik and these other outlets that are funded by Russia's government. That anyone who's ever been a contributor who appeared on a show on any of these networks is maybe considered affiliated with those networks. It's easy to make lists of people's names and go after them in these times of panic. Historically, I mean, we're having a kind of Red Scare moment again right now, and it's far worse than what we saw during Russiagate, in my opinion, just simply because what we're seeing unfold involves the immediate loss of life that is being blamed, and understandably so, on Vladimir Putin. But then for those people who try to apply a historical analysis or contextualize what they're seeing, if it is not within a certain spectrum of debate, then they start to go through your biography. They start to look at your past writings and see, okay, you might have sympathies, and then to label you. And the effort to label you is hugely disturbing when you look at what's already been done to people who are Russians within their country, and to think that could be coming for people here in the United States, that you would be fired from your job for publishing certain pieces, or you would lose your access to work and have professional ways to expand your career because of things that you had expressed previously. I think that's hugely troubling to me. And then this idea that people who are into this media, who might contribute to this media, would be working for Vladimir Putin is just ignorant, because most of these people who have had anything to do with it, including myself, I've appeared on Sputnik shows. I don't get paid. I've never been paid a single time. And also, most of these shows that I've done are with people who are Americans who are doing shows that have no platform in the United States, like CNN, MSNBC, NPR, any of these radio stations, community radio stations, whatever. They don't have deals to appear on those airwaves, and so they've taken the opportunity to get on a radio by way of this mechanism. So I just think that's one clear point to make.
Mm-hmm. No, very, very well taken points. And I'll also mention our good friends at People's Dispatch, peoplesdispatch.org, writing a lot about this. I know starting today, but they've got a number of pieces on the media censorship angle that people should look for. But I think those points are so well taken, Kevin. And it just leads me to kind of the other sort of thing we're seeing about our side, the U.S. media, is this just, and UK too. I know I shouldn't be surprised by this, but just the racism of some of the coverage around, the victims of Ukraine, and because of their affinity to whiteness, or I guess being white, that somehow they're more deserving. I mean, I know people have told me before, they're like, why are you surprised? But it has been a bit shocking to see how open we've seen some of these statements being made.
Yeah, and I don't think I can top what Ali Abunimah did for Breakthrough News the other day with Rania in that conversation. I won't try to replicate and repeat what he said. I'll just encourage your viewers to go watch that hour-and-a-half conversation that he had, which I thought was very illuminating. I will say that I think the outrage to the way people have described, and particularly these anchors and some of these European officials have described the crisis and what they're seeing, it's had an effect in that CNN is now actually covering every hour the racism happening at the border. And I noticed yesterday that a European commissioner, when confronted, at first called it fake news. He called it fake news, that these reports about how people are being mistreated. And when CNN said, I'm paraphrasing here, but we have the receipts, we talked to people, we confirmed, then he backed down and just gave them the letter of the law and how people should be all treated fairly. But it's pretty incredible that he just the immediate reflex was to say, oh, that can't be true, which is exactly what you'd expect from the Russian government. I mean, that's what we've been trained to think, that everything the Russian government is lies. And I think one of the things that people should recognize here, I'm kind of veering away from the topic of racism. I'll get back to it.
No,
but
please.
to make this quick point, that we've been led to believe that Ukrainians are less likely to lie to us than the Russian government. But we need to remember that in war, both sides of the conflict have incentives to not tell the truth, whether those are malicious or whether they are for good reasons. Both sides are going to cover up their losses. They're going to hide how badly the war is going for them. But that is not being truthful as well. So I just think we should be mindful of that. But the racism aspect, aside from what we've seen with the refugee crisis and some of the ways people talk about who is being targeted, we've seen this in the way that there's a reaction to alleged war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine already. Because in the coverage, they cover cluster bombs that are being used in Ukraine. But I think it manifests itself in a very racist manner because there's no reflection on the fact that, okay, you're talking about bombs that are being used in Yemen by Saudi Arabia, and these are bombs that are manufactured in the United States. And the people who are victims there and who are being killed are obviously of a much different shade of skin. And so it becomes pretty evident why we care about certain casualties more than other casualties. The same goes for referring these war crimes to the International Criminal Court for investigation. And you hear that being talked about on some of these news channels in the past 24, 48 hours. And nobody mentions that the United States isn't a party to the International Criminal Court itself. And also, nobody mentions that they are not signed on to the cluster bomb ban themselves and have resisted it. And even 1 year into Biden's administration, yesterday, the Pentagon was asked, why are you not a signatory? And they were like, oh, well, we're still working on it, which is a horrible answer. And it's also a lie. You aren't working on anything. We haven't been a signatory of the ban, and we have no intention to become a signatory of the ban. The only time we ever stopped using cluster bombs was when it became a PR nightmare for the Obama administration. But as long as there isn't any blowback as far as our image goes, we're going to keep allowing our allies and our own troops to use these banned weapons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would just like to add that I'm in Lebanon, where in 2006, just before the Israelis stopped bombing Lebanon, the last thing they did was they dropped millions of, there goes my electricity. The last thing they did is they dropped millions of cluster munitions on southern Lebanon. Until this day, every year, several children die thinking of their toys and picking them up. And there were never any repercussions for that. So there's also like a level of hypocrisy here, because none of these media organizations cared then. The US government didn't care then. They probably supplied those munitions. So much of the outrage and hysteria that we're hearing, it's like no one's suggesting what Russia's doing is okay. But at the same time, it's like a fraction of what the US does on a regular basis. So it's just, the hypocrisy is amazing.
It is. It is. Well, Kevin, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show. Shadowproof.com, thedissenter.org. I can't recommend it more highly. Obviously, Unauthorized Disclosure. I am a fan of that podcast as well. But once again, appreciate you, Kevin.
Well, keep up the excellent coverage, and thanks for giving space to people like us and these voices, and have a good rest of your stream.
Mm-hmm.